Hi, I'm David, and this is my channel Intention Simple. I'd like to bring you on a walk with me today through the landscape that I grew up in. This is the rolling prairies bordering the Rocky Mountains, which are off in the distance. This is the area that I grew up in. It was homesteaded not too long ago, in the mid-1900s, by my grandfather. Before that, it was just wild, wide open prairie. It's fascinating to think about the history of the place. Who used to live here, who traveled through, what the land was used for. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in looking at that history. Even though the land is pretty wide open, there are no trees, very little shelter, there are things that you can see if you look close enough. And today I'd like to show you a few of those things, so come along. So this land was in the territory of the Blackfeet Indians. They would roam this country, they would go on hunting expeditions, gathering resources, defending their land from other invaders, native invaders, and they would travel through. They wouldn't have permanent settlements. They also had very few possessions, and even more, few of any enduring nature. So there's very little to find from their time here. One of the things that you can find is at the end of their long expeditions, they would leave their boots on fence lines like this. Okay, just kidding. One of the things that you can find with some predictability is what's called a Tepee Ring. So the Indians would live in these teepees, which are made of buffalo skins. They're generally pretty small because the buffalo skins were heavy and they had to be transported by horse. They were small, they were portable, and in this windy climate, they had to be held down so they wouldn't blow away. So when the Indians would set up camp, they would set rocks around the edge of their teepee to hold the buffalo skin down. When the Indians would move on, they would just simply roll the rocks off the edge of the buffalo skin, let them sit there, and they travel on. So, inadvertently, they left a sign of their civilization. The Tipi Ring. On this land, there are lots of them. There are hundreds, if not thousands. In the land that has not yet been disturbed and turned into farmland, they're fairly easy to find. So the Indians preferred to camp on these elevated areas, these bluffs, and those are good areas to find teepee rings. Come along with me and I'll show you one. Alright, so here's an example of a teepee ring. You can just pick it out right about there. Hopefully you can see it in the video. So it's the rocks are only slightly elevated above ground level because over time they've settled into the ground. One other thing I wanted to mention is that teepee rings date from generally before the colonization of the western US, because once the white man came and brought metal tools like axes, then the Indians could make wooden stakes to stake down the edges of their teepees, which was more secure, and they didn't have to rely on rocks being available where they were camping. So these teepee rings could be, I'm guessing, from the early 1900s, late 1800s and before, potentially 1700s. Who knows how old they are really. But over time, they have sunk into the ground. Some of them, the older teepee rings, they would have disappeared entirely and you couldn't even see them nowadays. But anyway, so as you look at this, you can see, you can pick out the rocks. They're kind of irregularly laid, but they're there, and the soil that's blown in between the rocks has created kind of a raised area where the teepee ring is. Sometimes you can find a fire pit in the middle and there's a pile of rocks there. Sometimes, and I'll see if I can find one for you, sometimes you can see what's called a cache or a cairn, where the Indians would leave a pile of rocks covering some supplies. If you dig underneath those, sometimes you can find things. Here I'll just walk around a Tepee ring and show you what it looks like. It's just a ring of rocks pretty much. Not a whole lot to see. I stepped off this one just to see how big it was, and it was about 20 feet diameter, which is pretty big for a Tepee ring. I'll show you another one which is quite a lot smaller, but generally, again, like I said, because they were using buffalo skins, the teepees had to be quite small diameter. But some of these might date from when the Indians started using canvas, which was lighter, and they could make bigger teepees. Alright, here's an example of a smaller ring. You can see that the far side of the ring is fairly well defined. The rocks are still in place quite well. The near side of the ring is not quite as well defined. But this one is quite small. It's only about 8 feet diameter, which, if you imagine a family sleeping in that, that's not really very realistic. So I don't really know what the story behind this is. Potentially it was a small teepee for supplies, or to hold supplies, or for children to sleep in, or something. I don't really know, but that adds the mystery of these things. I also wanted to mention as well that I've heard that you can find quite large rings, 25, 30 plus feet in diameter, which were signs of ceremonial structures. So these were special spiritual places that the Indians would meet, and to accommodate the large number of people, they were made very large. They would put their extra resources into those. Here's another example of a ring just behind me. This one is about 12 feet diameter, which in my experience is fairly typical average size for a teepee ring. There are a couple of large rocks in the middle, and I wonder, those might have been used to hold down the ropes. They would have ropes coming down from the center of the teepee to hold down the middle, and those big rocks could have been used for that. Again, just a guess. So, like I said before, the Indians liked this sort of landscape. They liked the elevated bluffs. You can see how raised above the surrounding environment these bluffs are. Down below, there's a creek which would have provided some water for them, and the elevation provided an overlook in case anyone was coming to fight against them or try and raid them. They would have a good view far into the distance. So these are good spots to look for Tepee rings. There's one other thing I wanted to show you as well. So out in the middle of these nice, smooth, sculpted prairies, sometimes you come across something like this. This depression here in the ground. It's like a dish. And the story behind that is these lands used to be covered by millions of buffalo, or properly named bison. These buffalo would love to have dust baths or mud baths, and so sometimes they would scuff away the grass enough to create a sort of a bowl, a dish, and then they'd wallow around in the dust, or if it was wet, it would turn into mud, and they'd love the mud as well. So over time, these bowls would get eroded more and more. The dirt would blow away, wash away, and they would turn into what we call buffalo wallows now. Thank you very much for watching my video. I hope it was useful to you in some way, and I would encourage you to like it and also to subscribe to my channel. I plan to put up more videos about the history of this place, so if you'd like to see more, subscribe and you'll get notifications when they're posted. Thanks again, have a great day.